Okay, fantastic. So, why don't we go ahead and get started? To all who are joining us, welcome. So glad you could tune in. So, this is one of our many virtual events that we're running for this year's fifth annual Michigan Youth Consent Day. Um, Hoping if you caught our webinar last week, we did a virtual book club on Ask Building Consent Culture. This week, we've got a Youth Voice webinar. And next week on Tuesday, September 25th, is our official Michigan Youth Consent Day. Some events that we're running for that coming up are going to be our typical photo campaign on social media. So posting of photos, showing your support for consent educations and policies on your favorite social media platform with the hashtag #MyConsentDay. We also anticipate that for the fifth year in a row, we will have an official My Consent Day resolution passed through the House of Representatives. So we'll be posting that final link and then also the video as that's being read in. So tonight we're excited. Last year we did our first youth panel as a webinar, consent in different contexts. We're really excited about that. And this year we're looking forward to also sharing with you some information on how consent impacts younger populations. I feel like a lot of our dialogue around consent these days is very focused on the college culture, as it should be, but also there's a movement looking at how that plays out in K through 12 schools as well, because consent really starts from a younger age. And it's important that we get inclusive consent education in K through 12 schools. So I'm gonna give all our panelists an opportunity to introduce themselves. And I'm gonna start with a special guest panelist we have, Emily Sioma. She is a former My Voice member with Moash and was recently crowned Miss Michigan, and you might have seen her in the news for her fantastic introduction at the Miss America pageant. But I'll let her talk a little bit more with you herself. Go ahead, Emily.
Yeah, well, thank you for this introduction. I'm sad to say my intro won't be nearly as exciting or newsworthy, but I'm really happy to be included on this because through the Miss America organization, we are allowed the opportunity to develop platforms, which we now call social impact initiatives, and mine is called I Believe You, Supporting Survivors of Sexual Violence. And I think a lot of what led me to having the skills, the knowledge, and really the confidence to be able to come forward with this new platform, being that I am a survivor of sexual violence, is a lot of the culture that I kind of grew up in, I want to say, when I was in that really tough time getting right into college. And it was because of my voice and being a part of, a community of young people who are really inspiring and who are really inspired as well to do good by themselves and by the other people that they have in their community and in their schools. It really got me energized to want to turn this into an impact initiative so that way I could spread the message a little bit further because of my platform. So other than that, I've been working with, places in Ann Arbor that are local, like Safe House, working with them on how to, just be able to spread their message and make their resources known and a little bit more available to people. And then hopefully taking this platform a little bit further and partnering with national organizations like RAIN and seeing ways in which I can help them make their information a little bit more accessible to all people, because sometimes you just don't know what resources are around you. And because of that, to give you a little bit more detail about my social impact initiative, it's about empowering communities to be able to better support survivors. And so I've developed, kind of my 3-step process, which are questions that you ask yourself and you kind of create community-wide discussions about, which are how, what, and where. So the how is, how will you respond when someone discloses that they're a survivor? This happens to so many people that more than likely you are going to have a moment where someone discloses their assault to you. How are you going to respond? The what is the next step? So what resources do you have in your area, and how can you put a little bit of walk behind the talk to make sure that you're not just telling them you support them, but showing them by helping them find the next step on their journey to either prosecution or recovery. And the last question is where, and that's where are the holes in laws, policies, institutions, resources that are around us that are letting survivors fall through the cracks. So once we can find that where, then we can help be a part of the solution and create better and more equitable resources. So I've been able to champion that as my platform since I was crowned Miss Michigan in June, and I still have about 10 months left of being able to use this platform for good and supporting all survivors. So thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be a part of this.
Amazing. Thank you for all the work you're doing, and thank you for being on.
Yeah, thank you.
So now do introductions with our other 3 panelists who are all current My Voice members. Let's see, do we want to start with Xander?
Sure. My name is Xander Bailey. I'm a current My Voice member. I joined in September of 2017 or August or one of those. I currently attend Michigan State University, and I'm having a fun time there. I really am interested in the topic of consent, especially as it relates to youth, mainly because I want to help trans youth. That's kind of my passion area, is advocating for trans youth, either to advocate for themselves, and typically they're a marginalized community that doesn't realize that they have the power to consent or that consent is theirs to have.
Thank you. Now over to Ariana.
Hello, I'm Ariana Thornton. I turned 20 today, which is very weird because I went to automatically type 19, but that's not true anymore. I go to culinary school in Grand Rapids, and I've been a My Voice member. This is my 2nd year, and I'm interested in consent because we kind of barely start teaching it in high school, and by then a lot of damage can be done. So I'm interested in learning how we can teach it younger and make it more normalized.
Thank you, and happy birthday, and what a treat for us that you chose to spend it with us. And then I'll go over to Hiran.
Hi, I just became a My Voice member a few weeks ago, but thank you for having me. I use she, her, hers pronouns. I'm still in high school. I go to Huron High School in Ann Arbor. And I think that this panel really interests me because I've always lived in relatively liberal areas, and even then that are very socially aware. But even then, my education on consent has mostly come from my extracurriculars, which are things that I'm passionate about and that I go and seek. And I think that consent shouldn't be something you learn about only if you're passionate about sexual health. It should be something that everyone learns about because you're interacting with everyone on a daily basis.
Very cool. Thank you. So the 2 other faces you see on this call, I'm Brittany, she, her, hers. I work with Moash and just doing some moderating work in today's panel. And then we've got Stephanie.
Hey, I'm Stephanie, she, her, hers. Also work for Moash / will be moderating and all that good stuff.
So as we get started, just a few logistics about the webinar. So the panelists are the people whose faces you see. Everyone else is currently muted. We've got some prepared questions for the panelists. So we'll be going through that list. And then we do have some time built in at the end for anyone on the webinar to ask questions of our panelists. To do that, there are a few different ways. You can write in a question into the chat box. And we'll forward it from there. You're also welcome to raise your hand. That's an option you have on the bottom sidebar. And then I can give you permission to ask a question just audibly. Okay, did I miss anything, Stephanie? Is there anything else to know? I think the last thing is we do have a couple polls to go along with the questions that we have, just to get a sense of, how much the people on the call know about consent, when they learned about it, and how. So feel free to engage with those as they pop up. Is there anything else?
I think you covered it.
Phenomenal.
Should we move to our first question?
Ooh, please do.
All right. So we figured we'd kind of start with the basics of what's your definitions of definition of consent. So feel free to share any examples or metaphors, or kind of like, when you came up, when the definition became clear to you of consent. Feel free to jump in, panelists. Yeah.
I think that for me, I almost, like, in school never really came upon a definition of consent. I just kind of learned about it through, honestly, like through consent not happening. And so like through my friends, and then like ultimately like I've had experiences where like I have like not given consent. And I think that like the fact that I didn't even know about consent until I felt like something was wrong in the situation, like not with myself but with other people, hearing other people's stories, is like not right. And I think that it should be addressed earlier, but we'll get onto that later. But I think that formally, my first definition of consent came when I joined as a peer educator at Planned Parenthood, and we did a lot of work regarding sexual health, and we had workshops and stuff on consent. And so like what I was talking about earlier, that my like first like concrete definition of consent mostly came regarding like sexual activity, came in an area that like I specifically went out and sought, rather than like school or my parents or anything like that.
Thanks for sharing.
I would say that the first time I learned like a hard definition of what consent was in an outside of school activity. My health class freshman year briefly brought it up, but it was never discussed beyond, hey, you need this, okay, moving on. And I distinctly remember when I was trying to figure out what LGBT meant and trying to go through what's an identity, what is a relationship, what is romantic attraction, and trying to just make sense of everything that there was in the world, I came across a lot of affirmative consent versus just consent. And so when I finally actually started to go in depth about what is affirmative consent, I found that that's generally the definition that I appeal to, where it's freely given, it's reversible at any point, it's enthusiastic in nature, which means you don't have to like audibly be super enthusiastic, but you need to want whatever is happening, whether that's a high five from a stranger or a hug from a friend or intimacy in a romantic relationship, etc.
Lily.
I think for me, I was a little luckier, I would say, because growing up, my mom's always been like very inclusive. Like I learned about LGBT issues really early on. So for me, I have several siblings. So for us, she taught us consent by being like, if you want to give one of your siblings a hug, like they have to agree to it. You can't just go up and hug them. And like just little steps like that growing up, which I think helped, because it like was like a stepping stool up to like intimacy, because it's like, we realized, okay, you can't hug or do this to someone without them like saying yes if you ask them, up to like intimate relationships. I think I'm luckier there that I learned that younger. And I think, like Xander said, the whole freely given, enthusiastic can be reversed. My mom was always very like, I think at one point she printed out like a little piece of paper that said that, and we had it up just so we could all remember it.
Well, isn't there an acronym for that? Isn't it called like FRIES?
Yeah.
That is what I think of. And I mean, if I were to think back to high school, which feels like forever ago for me, being 25 now, or almost 25 now, feeling old, but I don't remember it ever being really stressed in that, consent wasn't more than just kind of a barrier you had to, or like you had to pass go and collect $200 kind of thing. Like it was just something you did because you had to, and you just kept going. And it was never anything that was made to seem like it had to come from both parties, or that it was continuous. And so my definition of consent never really formed until I was older, until I was a part of my voice and really had the opportunity to investigate for myself the difference between, a no means no versus yes means yes. And I think that's a very generational thing that people are starting to understand, was that for so long we've talked about no means no, but now transitioning into this yes means yes, it empowers people to be able to use their voice continuously, instead of, having to always voice a no. If you didn't get a yes, it's not a yes. And that's, where I have gone forward, being able to talk to friends and family, and strangers even, when I talk about my platform of supporting survivors. It always comes up, you are a survivor, what happened? And being able to talk about consent being continuous, and being more affirmative and positive, really changes and flips the script on people, and it makes them realize that consent is something different than what we've been taught for a long time.
This kind of pulls me into our next question about wondering, would ask the panelists, when should consent education begin and what should that look like? I've opened up another poll asking our participants, at what age did you learn about consent? And so far, I'm getting a lot of responses in the 15 to 20 range, 20 to 25, now someone a little younger, 10 to 15. So yeah, when should we start teaching about consent, and how do we do that?
I would say consent should be taught as young as it can be understood. So that means whether that's a toddler or kindergartner, where it's like, hey, if you want to ask your friend for a hug, you have to ask your friend for a hug and say yes. Or if you want to play with your friend on the playground, make sure that you're getting yeses, or just things that are kid appropriate, just changing the language to be more applicable to situations that they'll come across.
That's a good point. I think a lot of times we think about consent in more of a sexual or romantic context and don't really consider some of those other behaviors, like just hugs or more innocent touching, as also warranting using consent.
Yeah, I would say I have a 4-year-old cousin, and I have, since he was very little, you see that family dynamic where they're like, oh, go give your cousin a hug, go give her a kiss when I'm leaving. And I've really made it an opportunity where I always ask. And that being, someone who's 3-4 years old who understands, I ask, can I get a hug? And if he says no, I said, can I get a fist bump? And he usually agrees. But something like that, when we started at such a young age, that's when we can empower them to know that their voice matters and that having their boundaries respected, it just grows from there. And as you get older, you understand more concepts and you learn more things. And of course, consent is more than just about intimacy. Consent is about, your personal space, your boundaries, things you're comfortable with, and being able to talk about that first and then say, oh, consent in this realm that's not embarrassing or tough to talk about, we can translate that same concept into intimacy.
I agree with that. And I also wanted to say, you talked about, at a young age, not wanting to violate your cousin's boundaries and things like that. And I think that's also important because at such a young age, when you say no, I don't want a hug, and someone still tries to give you a hug, it's reinforcing that, your boundaries don't need to be respected. And then that in turn, it might not seem like that big of a deal to give your cousin a hug, and just it's cute, little kids running away, it's not that big of a deal, but just to have it reinforced over and over that these boundaries are important, you should listen to people's boundaries, I think would help, with so many people. And then when they reach an older age or an age where they're ready to have sex and have these sexual interactions, to understand that these boundaries are important and need to be respected, and having that come from such a young age, I think would help.
So we talked a bit about the age that consent education, formally or informally, might begin. Now I want to shift a bit and think about how do we effectively teach consent both inside and outside of the classroom. I'm going to put a poll up because I'm interested to hear about, where our participants kind of first learned about consent, and what are the different contexts? Could be family, friends, could be school, could be the media perhaps. So let me get that going as our panelists answer that next question about how do we teach consent?
I think a good way to start is like Emily said, when you're little and it's like, oh, go give so and so a hug. I remember being little and my Uncle Mark would always want a hug. And my mom was very much like, you don't have to if you don't want to, because I was always very uncomfortable hugging people besides like a few close. So I never did. And like growing up, that always was really helpful for me because like it helped. Like I would see my other cousins and like they would be forced to go give them a hug, and sometimes they'd cry and they'd be really upset because they're really uncomfortable and they don't want to do this, and they're kind of just pushed forward and forced. And like, yeah, it kind of reiterates the message that like at that point your feelings in the matter and how like you're reacting doesn't matter. Like if people, you kind of feel like people don't care, and so when you grow up feeling like that, you may like get yourself in bad situations just because you think that's the way it's supposed to be. So I think like just making sure younger kids know that they have a choice in situations like, oh, you don't have to have anyone like, you don't have to hug anyone you don't want to. If they even like, if they ask for a hug and you say no and they ask for a fist bump and you're okay with a fist bump, okay, cool. If you're not okay with a fist bump, you can say no, and like nobody's going to be upset. You're not going to get in trouble for saying no.
Yeah, I would say an example of something to do in the classroom is to just have a classroom rule where we always have the keep your hands to yourself, but that usually means like don't hit other kids, don't kick other kids, don't push, don't be violent or aggressive towards other kids. But it never really extends to like, oh, don't touch that kid's shoulder if they didn't say you could like grab them by the shoulder. It's just kind of reiterating that idea that you have consent over your personal space, you have control, and if people violate that, then the teacher should be able to step in and say, hey, that's not an appropriate thing to do, you always need to ask, and wait until someone gives you a positive response moving forward.
And I think this is actually something that I talked about when I was a panelist on the youth council before. I spoke with about 16 different school districts about ways that I would implement sexual education in schools. And this is a big passion of mine, hopeful that one day I'll be a part of sexual education reform. But I've always thought about the concept of, you know, when you're in high school, who are the coolest people that you think of? Like, of course, it's the upperclassmen. And who are you more likely to listen to? It's going to be the people that you think are really cool. And so turning sexual education into something that's really cyclical, so that when you're a freshman, you're learning about sexual education that's important and pertinent information to you. And then when you're a senior, because what you're going to be doing off of college is a very different context from the situations that you're in as a freshman in high school. But having a part of your senior year curriculum in sexual education be going back, creating your own curriculum and teaching freshmen. You know, I think kids are more likely to listen to their peers than they are to adults, just mostly because we feel like they're out of touch, or the context is so different, or, you know, we're too embarrassed to hear adults talk about sex and things like that. But when you hear people that are in your age group, that are peers, or even people you look up to in school, be able to talk to you a little bit more real about, you know, this is my high school experience in this context. I lived it 3 years ago. And also, you know, teaching something is a form of mastery. So when you have to go back in and talk about something, you have a better understanding of it than you did if you were to just sit down and listen to it. So hopeful that one day we'll be able to create a culture within a school that allows, you know, upperclassmen and underclassmen to be able to talk more about their experience, and then prepare both freshmen and seniors for the different contexts they're going to be entering in as they enter high school, as well as when they enter college.
So I'm sharing the results of this poll that I think is really interesting, based on where people learned about consent. A few things of note. I don't know if anyone wants to pull out anything, but I can see there's nothing in K through 12 schools.
Yeah.
And, you know, I would note that right now, in Michigan sex ed law, it is not a requirement for explicit consent to be taught. There is a requirement or standards around teaching certain refusal skills and some basic healthy relationship behaviors, but in terms of explicitly defining consent, what it looks like, how to give and deny consent, how to accept someone denying consent from you, that is not something that's currently required. So that might be an area of work in future. But looking at where people do learn about consent, we've got friends, family members, so those close, intimate relationships that they already have, people are looking to people that they know, people that they already trust for those messages. Then also looking at getting some more information about entering the college atmosphere, which is good. But then the media stands out as one of the greatest teachers around consent, maybe what it looks like, maybe healthy or otherwise. So just wondering if any panelist wants to comment on kind of what it looks like in the media, whether we think it's like a good portrayal of consent in different contexts, whether you see positive or maybe negative examples, and maybe what we can do in the media space to teach people about consent.
I'm one of the people that answered media, and I think that my first the first time I ever saw consent in the media was my dad and I used to watch Law and Order SVU together, which was like kind of strange for a little kid to be watching, but it's fine. And we used to watch that together, and I was probably a little too young for it, and I think that for me, I was kind of shocked at first a little bit that people even did those types of things, that people would actually sexually assault one another, and that people would violate consent. And I think that, so I don't know if it's really a positive or a negative, but the way that I saw it wasn't that I saw consent happening, it was that I saw consent not happening. And that's how I realized that you need consent.
More of what not to do rather than what is good consent.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Anybody else want to add on to commenting on the poll results?
I actually can't remember any instances of seeing them talk really about consent in anything I watched, which seems really weird thinking back on, but it might have just been because I was a really weird kid watching really weird nerdy shows. So.
That's fine.
I think it's interesting to think about SVU, certainly because the scenarios in that show are so extreme, right? Mm-hmm. You're getting very clear rape and sexual assault cases that are being shown. And maybe that sometimes does a disservice to us when we talk about consent, because it's kind of nothing or rape. And there's a very broad spectrum of other problematic, unhealthy, non-consensual behaviors, whether that's, coercion, threats, other types of aggression, gaslighting. And that is also a consent issue, but just isn't as clearly defined. And sometimes, I don't know, I find going in and talking with young people in some of the sex education programming that we do, that they don't conceptualize other things as being a scenario in which consent should be asked for.
I think that in a lot of the TV shows, now that I've never really thought about the TV shows I watched when I was younger. I just thought about SVU as that was I clearly knew that when I was watching that wasn't consent. But thinking back on it now, some of the TV shows that I watched, not when I was young, I don't really remember the ones I watched when I was really young, but the ones that are on Disney, the ones like Good Luck Charlie or Victorious or whatever, that I watched when I was maybe 10 to 13, somewhere in there. a lot of the times they would portray like the men or that were in relationships with women, and like that not asking for consent when it comes to like hugging, or like when they're in a fight just like randomly hugging, and like even when the girl would like push them away, like, you know, that's still like that's the way to deal with things, was to just like kind of like force the woman into it, like. And I never even thought about that because it was just so normalized in TV shows, and just like in our culture. Like even now I have friends that you know, will like just accept that, you know, like if they're in a fight, if they're in a fight with like their boyfriends and stuff, like just like accepting, you know, like their boyfriends will like or they'll be pushing away their boyfriends, and like their boyfriends will still be hugging them, and I'm like, that's not okay. Like they clearly don't want to be hugged right now. But I think that I saw that in the media from like a very young age and just didn't acknowledge it until like thinking back on it now.
Yeah. I feel like this, what not to do. And I mean, I feel like in sex ed programs, and maybe not sex ed programs in school, it is very much like they teach about sexual assault, and it's just like, okay, now don't do that. Where I feel like we could definitely raise the bar a little. Like we talked about, it should be enthusiastic and affirmative, and like listening to people's body language. And I think that's really important to teach that. So it's like, not only is that like, I feel like not sexual assault is such a low bar, but rather we really want people to strive to this like higher level of like communication and having great interactions. So how would you all say that we could reach to normalizing consent like this? And, you know, if you could maybe give examples of how like to ask for consent, or how you would maybe like turn somebody down. It doesn't have to be like sexual situation, just whatever you want to share.
Yeah, well, thinking about just normalizing consent in general, a part of what I do as Miss Michigan is, of course, going to events and taking photos with people. And I find myself in a lot of situations where people will, because of, you know, who I am in that context, not necessarily asking for my consent for a lot of things, whether it's photos or, you know, wanting to come up and get a hug. And, you know, sometimes it's children, so they don't quite understand it. But, you know, sometimes I even find there are adults that clearly don't have a respect for, you know, my space, my time, what I'm actually supposed to be there doing. And so to normalize it, I try and use every moment that I can to flip it on them, and to use it not as a teachable moment, but just to show everyone around that, you know, I'm conscious of the space that I take up. And especially when I get photos with people, I'm really, I strive to every time ask, may I put my arm around you? Is it all right if I take a photo with you? And putting the power back and their voices back into their own hands. And so I think normalizing it is, like you said, raising that bar and not discounting people. And you know, I always think about, you know, men in these situations, they feel as though it's always their duty to get consent, but it's everybody's. It's everybody's, I would say, not necessarily opportunity, but you have to. Everybody is a part of the conversation. All of our voices are just as important as the next person's. And so, you know, whoever has the most power in the situation, you know, that doesn't matter. Your voice and your consent is still just as important. So making sure, you know, if you do it in everyday life, if you're asking people, you know, can I get a photo with you? Or when you're getting a photo, can I put my arm around you for this photo? People are kind of taken aback, like, oh my gosh, she's asking. No one's ever asked me about this before. It's just been something I do. And so being able to kind of insert that level of consent and giving people their ability to voice, you know, whether or not they feel comfortable with something, I hope empowers people to be able to use that a little bit easier in their everyday life.
Totally. Yeah, I love that about giving back the power to people and just like modeling it. I feel like that's so often people just like don't know how. And if you just show them an example, like, oh, I can totally do that.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody else want to add to this one?
I agree with everything you said. I think that's great. And I also think like one thing that I think helps normalize it that you kind of touched upon is asking for consent in like larger situations, like when other people are around. Like I'm guilty of this, like in large situations, like sometimes I'll forget, or sometimes like I'll feel uncomfortable when like I know that no one around me is really like conscious about consent, like especially in high school situations. Like in high school, no one asks like, can I like touch your shoulder? Can I give you a hug? But like when I do ask, and especially like with my friend groups and things like that, like people will always ask me about it and be like, oh, like why'd you do that? Or like, yeah, like that's fine. Like why'd you ask? And then like having that opportunity, like having them ask me, and then like gives you a platform to explain it, and explain why that's important. So I think that, as hard as it is, like being the person that's like kind of weird and like out there, like putting yourself out there, and like being a resource for other people, definitely will help normalize consent, because I think that part of the problem is like the lack of education, like we talked about. And so just like making it something that you do all the time.
And you said that, it made me think of it. I think it's sort of similar to like asking people's pronouns, because, sometimes people think like, oh, why are you asking? Isn't it obvious? And it's like, okay, you may look like you're female, but I don't want to assume that. So I'm going to ask. And it's kind of like, there are people who are going to think you're weird anyway for asking because it's not normalized right now. There are also people who are going to like hear you do this, whether you're saying it to someone else or you're saying it to them. And it kind of like gives them that little bit of trust and like the realization that like, oh, someone actually cares about this. Like when I'm in class, I was in class today, and like someone asked before they gave me a hug, even though they're all like, oh, it's your birthday, let's all celebrate. They stopped and asked. And it's like, they don't know that like I have problems with people randomly hugging me or touching me. Like that's not something they were aware of beforehand, but they still asked, like as if they would ask anybody. And that was like really comforting for me, because I'm like, now I don't have to worry about like anyone randomly grabbing me or touching me, because I know these people care enough to ask.
Definitely, that really helps create a safe space for people to know you're like a person that's gonna like check in, even when it's like, I really appreciate even when it's like somebody I've been friends with for years and I haven't seen in a while, and we like, even though we've hugged like hundreds of times, like it's always like good to like check in, because you just never know what kind of like space people are going to be in. And so just shifting gears a little bit, obviously there's been a lot changing in the past year with conversations and more awareness with the Me Too movement. So just like want to hear from you all how the Me Too movement has impacted your community or your school, your bubble, whatever it is.
I think that the Me Too movement has had many pros and also like a few cons as well, when it comes to like actually like living out daily life. I think that some of the like I had this question written down. This is my longest one, but some of the pros for like the Me Too movement is like just creating conversation and like making people feel comfortable enough to come out and say like, me too, and like things like that. Just like making survivors feel comfortable and feel like they're not alone in this is incredibly empowering. As well as just like creating conversation and making it more normal to talk about sexual assault has definitely been like a huge benefit from the Me Too movement. I think personally, one thing that the Me Too movement has made a little bit more difficult is the reaction of a lot of men towards it, which is obviously like not something that you should like tell a woman to stop talking about their sexual assault with, but it is something that's happened. Like I have family members who are like not as socially aware and open-minded as I like to think I am, and that'll complain about like, they feel uncomfortable being alone with women in the office, and like it's making them afraid and like things like that. And like I have a million things I can say back, but just the fact that like they're like this Me Too movement, like it's just making me so afraid. And like obviously like that's not like, it's valid, it's definitely valid, but it's like, like it's like silencing women over like you're being afraid to close the doors, you have to, you win some, you lose some, but like men's reactions to it have definitely sometimes not been as great. Even like in schools, I've had male teachers like, I'm applying to colleges right now and like talking, I have I don't want to say who the teacher is, but I have a teacher who was reading my college essays, and it's about something that's very personal to me. And so I wanted to shut the door, and they were like very, very, like when I was like, can I shut the door? They almost like jumped at it, And so I think that, I don't know if that comes directly from the Me Too movement, but just like you can see like how, men are just like kind of thinking about this, like constantly in the way that it's like in our schools. And then I also think that, especially in high school, I don't want to say that like people make fun of it, but people kind of toss it around very like easily, like almost like avoiding the word sexual assault. They'll say like, like the Me Too movement and like things like that. And like, especially I've seen with some of the like boys at our school, it's almost like mocking it, which is obviously not okay. But I think that, sometimes like seeing such a large group of women can cause like, just based on the sexism in our society, like men to react in like different ways. And I feel like I'm targeting men a lot here, but like I've just, from the reactions that I've seen, like it's been largely men that I've seen react negatively towards it. Sorry, that was a lot.
No, I do want to pull in. I think it's really important that, we notice that when you talk about this, you talk about the Me Too movement only benefiting women. And I think it's because we haven't done enough to use the Me Too movement to benefit men who have been victims of sexual assault themselves. The fact that we, talk about this as a women's movement, like, yes, this affects so many women. And a lot of my platform stems from empowering women who are survivors, because that's, the experience I've had and the truth that I know. But the Me Too movement, I think we aren't doing enough to make sure that the men who have been victims themselves feel as though this is a movement they can identify with. Because this was, of course, created for young Black and brown women to feel as though they have a community, because they didn't feel comfortable talking about it at first within their own community. But now that it's exploded and become something so mainstream, being able to be inclusive of anyone who is a survivor, not just men and women, but also non-binary and trans folks, because the Me Too movement for me, as someone who was sexually assaulted and who uses Me Too as a way to say, this happened to me too. We can talk about it. We can feel this is a common ground. Making it more inclusive and more welcoming to all people who have been survivors, I think is really how we show people who are taking it less serious, who use it as a joke or who use it as an excuse to be like non-confrontational, to show them that, this isn't a woman's issue, this isn't a man's issue, this is everybody's issue. And until we resolve it or find solutions, we all have to deal with the fact that so many people use Me Too as an identifier.
Yeah. I think you bring up another thing with that, Emily, about how so often consent is framed in a kind of a negative context, right? This risk of sexual assault, harassment. And I think we don't do enough framing consent as like, what are the benefits about consent? How good it can feel knowing that, whoever you're engaging with is, fully enthusiastic about what's happening, and you have like a verbal confirmation, how that can be such a benefit to your relationship, whether romantic or otherwise. It's always kind of framed as like avoiding negative outcomes versus looking at the positive benefits.
This might be a little, I don't know, out there. Like this isn't like, I don't think this is a common story, but after the whole Me Too thing came out, my dad works in a government office, and it's like mostly women. He's like one of maybe 5 guys and one of 2 Black people there, so it's a little weird. But after the Me Too movement got really popular, one of the women in the office actually came to light that she was like, something had happened with her husband. Her husband had actually been like abusive and sexually assaulted her, and so like she was getting a divorce, and like everyone in the office was really supportive, because like with the help of this movement, they saw like how many people were affected by this. And they saw her and were like, we worked with you every day and we had no idea that this kind of thing happened. But we can also see like online the Me Too thing everywhere, and they're like, yeah, I've finding out, like, my cousins and all this are saying that this happened to them. So, like, she got a lot of support there. And I remember my dad coming home and, like, talking to my mom, and he's like, yeah, she came in every day. She's, like, one of the coworkers I talked to the most. And, like, this never even occurred to me because she never seemed to have a problem. And he was always, like, he found out about it and he saw the whole Me Too thing, and he like started doing a bunch of research, and he's like, what can I do to be supportive here? So he's been like, it's been really nice because he's always been kind of like trying to learn more about activism stuff because I've been doing it for several years. But I think this was another big push for him, like, because he's kind of always had a bit of a problem about the whole not all men and stuff like that thing. And I think this was kind of like a wake-up call for him as well to realize like how pervasive this issue is and how far it spreads.
Thanks for sharing that. So we're about to get to our last prepared question. So just heads up, if you want to start, our audience members, feel free to start typing in your own, and we'll get to them after. But one piece of advice you'd give to those like educators, health professionals, supportive adults that are teaching consent in some capacity to young people?
I think I would, it's really not as, I feel like, you know, because it's not normalized, when people think of teaching consent, they try to, like, they're kind of like, oh, it's such a big topic, and it's, you know, for older, like, little kids aren't going to be able to understand. I think, like, starting small, like, the whole you don't have to accept hugs you don't want, and like, you're allowed to make choices about, you know, your body and your boundaries and all that. And just, like, because it's kind of like, if you start there, then later you can build up to the, like, you don't have to start right away at making it sexual for a 5-year-old. Like, I can understand where that's uncomfortable. But, like, you can start with, you know, yes, you're allowed to make your own boundaries. And then later they can move up and it kind of stacks because they'll realize, you know, by the time they're older and, like, they may be in an intimate relationship, they can kind of, it's more normalized for them to be like, even I'm allowed to make boundaries and have these decisions. And, like, the whole Fry's consent thing, even if I give consent, like, now, if in 5 minutes I say, you know, never mind, I don't want to do this, I take it back, you're allowed to take it back and make that decision for yourself.
Oh, I would agree with Ariana. I also want to apologize. The dorm I'm in had a fire alarm, so I had to, like, leave the building for a few minutes. I would say, in terms of making an educator's point of view on how to teach consent, I would just focus it around bodily autonomy, as in I'm in control of my own body, and what consent means is how I interact with those around me and how those around me can interact with me in a way that's comfortable, safe for all parties.
I definitely agree with that. And I think that also, especially when, like, in the older grades, like, you know, like middle school and high school, when educators are talking about consent, making it not sound like a chore, like, not sound like, all right, like, you know, you have to get your consent, like, you know, like, that's not, like, then no one's going to want to do it, you know, like, so, like, not making it sound like a chore, making it sound like something, like Brittany was talking about earlier, like something that's going to make the relationship better, like that's a positive thing instead of a negative thing, I think is so important, because I don't think I've ever heard like a health teacher or any teacher talk about consent in a way that's not like a chore, like not like something you just have to get over with. And then I also think that talking about that we should work like in schools on talking about consent in like not a binary way, and not just like men asking women for consent all the time, like something that everyone needs to do, like regardless of whether it's like actual vaginal sexual intercourse or whether it's like whatever you're doing, that it should be something that everyone is doing and not just like one like male partner in the relationship doing to a female partner.
And I'll jump in just at the very end of this to for anyone that watches this who is a sex educator, who has the opportunity to talk to other people about it, my biggest thing is like, just, you have to forego the ego on all of this, because, even someone who is extremely comfortable talking about sex, there are moments when it's like, ooh, I don't know how I feel about talking to you about this right now. But you just have to be okay with, being a little bit uncomfortable and letting other people know, like, while you're having this discussion with them, if you are leading a class or a one-on-one conversation, that you don't know everything, that you're constantly learning, because we all are. And owning up to that, I think, is one of the biggest parts of, helping people break down those walls and say, this is something that's so important, we need to be taking it seriously. And admitting that, you don't always know what's right, it gives you the opportunity to learn together. And I think that's one thing that one thing that we do a little bit wrong in the classroom, especially regarding sexual education, is we look to this one person who's teaching our sex ed class as the person who knows everything. And we do that for a lot of our teachers, and we put them on this pedestal, when I think it should be really learning from everybody, having an opportunity to learn from your peers, to learn from not just one teacher, but multiple teachers or outside resources, because you can get a more comprehensive education from that, learning different perspectives, because we don't always know what's right, and we're constantly growing and evolving and learning new ways to frame consent. Even now, learning new ways from all of you that I can talk about this to people in the future, and just foregoing that ego for a few minutes when you have the conversation, especially because, when you're someone that's older talking to someone that's younger about this, you want to feel like you know more than they do, but it's okay to not sometimes.
Totally. Thanks for all that input. I think we're going to go ahead and move into audience questions now. So again, you can chat your question, or you can raise your hand and ask your question out loud, audibly, verbally, whatever the word is.
As people are mulling that over, I want to mention a couple of resources, because it's always nice to know, like, okay, I want to start, talking more about consent. How do I do it? In addition to all the fantastic suggestions that were given, just put a link in the chat about some national resources. These are particularly for sexual assault survivors. Just to pass that along, because I know we've bringing up some heavy examples, so just want to make sure that everyone has a place to go and get more info and reach out if they require support. Other great educational resources that are free, online, accessible. There's some great YouTube videos now, just short little snippets. I think most people have heard of the consent is as easy as tea. That can be a nice introduction to the idea. A group called Amaze makes age-appropriate videos on a number of different sexual and reproductive health topics. There are free curriculums that you'll find online. Advocates for Youth put together a free K through 12 curriculum. It's called Rights, Respect, Responsibility, or the 3 R's curriculum. And so you can search. There are consent, healthy relationships, boundaries, bodily autonomy lessons for all different levels.
And you can always reach out to us at MOASH if you have like a specific question or concern. And we've got more resources on our My Consent Day website, myconsentday.org.
Mm-hmm. Oh, we have from Amanda, if people need access to resources, Michigan also has the new helpline that's free and confidential, available 24/7, 855-VOICES-4. Thank you.
Audience members can jump in at any time, but while we were talking, I had a question that came up is, how do you feel like you see sex positivity or sex negativity play into these conversations around consent and teaching consent?
I would say a lot of the times in health classroom situations, it's always I would say it's more in a sex negativity direction, where it's consent is this barrier that you need to overcome in order to do anything, as opposed to just being an organic part of a relationship and interacting with other people. Whereas a lot of the times in the sex positivity movement, I hear a lot about affirmative consent, or I'm heavily involved in the LGBTQ community, and a lot of that topics that come up is like asexuality and sex positive versus sex negative versus sex repulsed on the ace spectrum. And so a lot of the times consent isn't even inherently sexual in those conversations, but you still need to bring up the sex positivity versus the sex repulsed so that you can kind of navigate that conversation in a better way. Does that make sense?
Definitely. Anyone else want to add to this one?
Like I think Helen was saying earlier about, like when I was trying to think about it, like in health class, I remember in high school, it was very, abstinence-based and judgmental. And I think about like with our consent education was very, there wasn't even really a consent education, if I would say. It was really just like, very much women like are meant to do what their husbands want them to, which is so 1950s. I don't know where I was living at the time, but like we wouldn't talk about consent like this, and it was just, it was, you don't have sex until you get married, and you only do what your husband. So it wasn't, I think, for like very, when people are trying to be like abstinence only, let's not talk about sex, they don't talk about consent either, and that leads to like a lot of issues because, not all these teenagers are going to wait until they're married to be intimate with someone. And now that you haven't told, like you've told them those are their two options and they're going to go off the rails and do something else, they're not even going to think about this, and it's going to lead to like larger consequences than if you had just explored how consent, like explore the levels of consent, not levels, that's the wrong term, that sounds really bad, but like explored the whole fries thing. I think is like my favorite example of this. I love this. I'm gonna have to like print this out again. Just like, yeah, not only should it be freely given, but like, yes, it is reversible. If you say, you want to do something and then halfway through you decide you don't, that's an option you're allowed to take. And because kids aren't being told these, it's like they're trying to stop people from having sex, and really all they're doing is like they're just encouraging students to have more dangerous sex.
Erin, I'm not sure if you're going to go. I'll just jump in really quickly to go off what you were saying about, teaching abstinence only and not talking about consent. Consent still doesn't have to be present within a marriage or within any kind of like long-term relationship with someone. And for a long time, that was never acknowledged as something that needed to be present. I think until 1993, sexual assault was not anything that you could legally bring up against your spouse. And so consent does have to be present. And the fact that if we're still teaching abstinence only until marriage education, and we're not putting an emphasis on consent, even within a marriage, we're doing a disservice to all people. Because, you'll find yourself in an intimate relationship or, with a spouse, you still have to be, that communication has to be a part of that relationship, especially if you plan on being intimate with that person. And so you do need to be able to use and be knowledgeable about what consent is, even if you are married or even once you are married. So I think it's important that we remember that too, is that it's not just about having sex with different partners who aren't your spouse. It's about, having that communication between two people, no matter what your relationship to one another is.
I definitely agree with both of you. And I think that Ariana brought up a really interesting point about sex negativity in the health classroom. And I think that a lot of this lack of consent talk has to do with how stigmatized talking about sex with teenagers is, and how just in general, most, if not I want to say, I don't want to say all because I'm sure there's a few like really good health teachers out there, but most high school health classrooms are not sex positive environments. And I teach contraception and LGBTQ for Planned Parenthood in sex ed classes or in health classes. And I think that like going in there, and we're all very sex positive, but like we can't be extremely sex positive because it's just such a shock for these like high schoolers that like people are even willing to talk about sex this openly. Like, and you know, like that's us being like our like very moderated like selves, you know, and like the fact that like people are just so surprised that sex is like able to be talked about this openly, I think definitely speaks to the fact that most classrooms aren't very sex positive at this point.
Yeah, I think that's definitely the case, unfortunately. Well, we are out of time, so thank you so much to all of our panelists for taking the time to be here tonight, and for attendees. I know it's late on the evening, so Brittany posted our website and the link to our Facebook event. So definitely check those out, and yeah, feel free to contact us. Our contact info is on the website. If you have any questions about anything, and again, thanks so much for being on today, our attendees and panelists. So hope everybody has a great night.
Yeah. Thank you. Have a
Thank
good
you
day.
so much. Take care.